Hello, you're listening to Don't Listen to This podcast, all about 1001 albums to listen to before you die, or allegedly should. I'm your host, Ewan Gleadow. I've still got hearing in one ear, and that's always a positive. If you can hear out of one ear, you can hear half of an album, and you just listen to it twice. But as ever, I'm joined by a number of guests and people that know about music more than me, because, to be honest, I don't really know that much. But today I'm very happy to be joined by the absolute jet-setting sensation that is Callum Rowe. Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. Nice to see you. I've got two working ears, which meant I just had to listen to Band on the Run just once rather than
That's
twice. So that gives me an edge, certainly straight away.
There's no need to brag about working ears, honestly. Some of us have had to deal with this for months, by which I mean me. But no, thank you very much for joining. As you just gave away there, we are talking about Band on the Run by Paul McCartney and Wings, and I'm really glad we've had to make that distinction almost immediately, because this might as well just be a Paul McCartney album. I'm sure we'll talk about that, but Wings are very much out of the picture on this one. But before we get into Wings, and I know you've just said you've listened to Band on the Run, but what else have you been listening to recently? What's been on the agenda?
Well, I don't know how appropriate it is to say on this podcast that I really quite like the Eurovision Song Contest. But I kind of follow what this year's artists have been doing over the summer in terms of their live dates and their recent releases. What's the best thing I've probably listened to? There's a Portuguese lady called Maro. She released an album. I wish I could remember the title of it now. Can You See Me? I think it's called. I'll get back to you on that one. It was a predominantly English language album, which was a bit of a surprise, considering the song she had at Eurovision called Saudade, Saudade. But it was so personal and intimate, and it really kind of, when I was listening to it, it made me feel like she was telling me the story. And I think if an album can make you do that, make you feel like you are the only listener, then I think it's done its job.
Absolutely, yeah. I can't disagree with that. There's certain albums where you listen to them and you finish and think, that was for me. That was like, that's so personal. It's always nice when you come across those albums, and yeah, I wish I'd been listening to more of that.
It's rare as well that you get that where you feel so personally connected to it, because sometimes you'll get to an album and go, that was all right, yeah, it was good. I kind of got the message of it, but it's rare that you kind of personally feel it rather than just sort of, in the background kind of feel it, if you know what I mean.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think it's like 90% of music is like, I can understand why people would connect with this, but it's just not for me. Where like I can appreciate it. I'm not going to like disparage anybody that can hear real beauty in the music. It's just not for me. It might just be a different point of interest, or it might be a different avenue of life. But it's always nice that there's so much music out there that you can connect to. Mm-hmm. It's always nice to hunt it down, unlike Ringo Starr's new EP, which is grim. I'm sorry, but I listened to it and I've got to get it in there that it is shit. What isn't shit?
Did you have to listen to that one twice as well?
I did, yeah. So 16 times 2, what's that? 20...
32.
32, is it? 32. Yeah, 32 minutes I gave to Ringo Starr, and that was after listening to his final album.
32 too many, I'd say.
God. Speaking of final albums, not Band on the Run, which is the third album by Wings and Paul McCartney. Just to rattle down before I do this lovely insert from the people that wrote in the book for the 1001 Albums to Listen to Before You Die by Robert Dimery, and a collection of editors and journalists that I'm sure if they heard any of these episodes would quite probably sue me. Keynotes about Band on the Run, 1973, as we mentioned, Paul McCartney and Wings. The lineup, though, Paul McCartney, Linda McCartney, Denny Lane, Ginger Baker, and Tony Visconti, which is quite the eclectic collection of artists there, especially Visconti, who I'm sure we'll touch on later, because seeing his name crop up was quite the surprise. It's always nice to see him up there. But Band on the Run falls under pop rock, art rock, folk pop, and progressive pop, which is as difficult as it sounds to say with all the pop. And this is apparently the last album McCartney issued on Apple Records. It was the last one he did, allegedly. I'm only going off Wikipedia because that's the extent of my research today. Because a lot of
it sounds about right. It sounds about right.
Yeah. It's in between that gap of he's just done Abbey Road and then Michael Jackson bought his music. somewhere
Yeah.
in there. It's in between that bit. But there's a lot to talk about with this album. But before we even get the chance to speak, before we even get the chance to think about what we think of the album, I do have to read the insert, which is a lovely 4 paragraphs. So I'll have a nice sip of water and we'll crack on. Paul McCartney's early solo work did little to suggest he could make timeless music outside the Beatles. He delivered solitary gems, notably Maybe I'm Amazed and Live and Let Die, but at full albums such as 1973's Red Rose Speedway were not Beatles-esque killer. Moreover, McCartney, who had recently garnered headlines for a drugs bust, went on to work on his album with more than a few feathers missing. Drummer Denny Sewell, one of the two.
I
It's
think
got
it's
an E and an
Sewell. Yeah,
I.
let's go Sewell.
Sewell.
Yeah.
And guitarist Henry McCullough split a week before the band flew out to record in Lagos, Nigeria. And when they got there, McCartney and wife Linda were robbed at knife point. But out of adversity, McCartney dominated every inch of what was essentially a solo record. Band on the Run kicks off with its roller coaster of a title track, a kind of mini suite actually, recalling the heavily nuanced arrangements of the side 2 Abbey Road song cycle. He immediately makes good on that high-flying start with a punchy jet and continues to soar through the sunny Bluebird, a companion piece of sorts to the Beatles' Blackbird. The work momentarily stumbles on Let Me Roll It, a misguided answer to Lennon's scathing How Do You Sleep, but again finds focus thanks to solid side 2 tracks like Mamounia and No Words. 6 mainly British celebs co-starred on the Prison Break cover, half suggesting a scaled-down Sgt. Pepper, fittingly so, as Band on the Run also proved a critical and commercial hit, and one that stands as the singer-songwriter bassist's finest post-Beatles hour. A lot of information there, a lot of I don't agree with, but what do you think? What are your memories with Abbey Road? What are your memories with Band on the Run? That threw me when they mentioned Abbey Road there.
Band on the Run is probably something I've discovered as an album quite late. So Band on the Run, the track, is something I remember from Guitar Hero World Tour, I think it was. And I think a lot of people might resonate with that as well. It was, what was it, Christmas 2008? I think I got this game. I got a brand new Xbox 360. This was the first game I got for it, so it was quite an introduction to this new console. And on Boxing Day, we took this game and this Xbox to our auntie's house, who always hosts like a big do on Boxing Day. And Band on the Run and Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi were the 2 songs that just got repeated and repeated and repeated. I think we all got absolutely sick and tired of both of them, but Band on the Run it was a lot more palatable for a Boxing Day, because there's only so much of people screaming. What song was it again?
Living on a Prayer, Bon Jovi.
Living on a Prayer. I know I said Live and Let Die. Living on a Prayer. There's only so much. There's only so much of that you can take. People screaming at the top of their lungs. But yeah, the record itself is something that I discovered a lot later, because about 4 or 5 years ago, my brother got a record player for his birthday, and it was his record player, but I just thought, well, I'm just going to buy some records because I want a collection now that he's grown one.
Yeah.
And I was listening to a lot of Beatles at the time, but never really discovered Wings or Paul McCartney and Wings. And then I can't remember what made me think of it, but I found a copy of it on vinyl through, and I'm not sure of the ethics of this, through a charity shop on Amazon, which I don't know. I don't know how much money Amazon were taking of a cut from a charity shop.
100%, I imagine.
Probably, yeah. So I don't think this small, leukemia charity in the southeast of England got any of my £5. But what I did discover when it arrived was that it was an actual original pressing of it, which is absolutely ridiculous. I've not valued it or gone to find out how much it's worth. I kind of like to live in the mystery of knowing how much it is, but I know it's precious.
I'll give you £10. You can double your money. That'd be great.
Not a chance.
I've genuinely, since I heard the album a couple of years ago, have been looking for a vinyl of it, and I've had no luck. The only option I've had so far is Amazon telling me it might be back in stock at some point, and that's it. And I always miss it.
The great thing is, the great thing is after I bought that copy, my brother and I were rooting around in my auntie's loft, the same auntie who hosts those Boxing Days, and we stumbled upon her old record collection. And what did she have in there? An original pressing of Band on the Run. So we got two on that shelf over there.
That is the essential definition of greed. That is a deadly sin in some cases. Have you seen the movie Seven? That's you, all of it.
I haven't seen the movie, but I feel like that's a recommendation I need to.
It's solid. It's very good. I don't mean to branch off into movies on this podcast, but it's very good. But speaking of movies, my introduction to Paul McCartney's music, not just Band on the Run, not just Live and Let Die, but actual Paul McCartney music was Shrek 3. And the death of the Frog Prince, voiced by John Cleese, where they played Live and Let Die and they sang it with the Frog Ensemble. Yeah, that was my first experience of a Paul McCartney solo album. Obviously, when I was 6 at the time of the film coming out, it didn't make much of an impression because I thought, oh, where's the Green Man gone? But as you develop a brain over time, you think how many good songs are in those little pockets of childhood innocence. It's like, I'm glad you brought up Guitar Hero. I think about 80% of the music I now listen to was sort of something I stumbled on Guitar Hero all those years ago, but never actually gave any thought to beyond I like playing the sequence in this order. I think Band on the Run for me, though, was sort of, the title track was known because I'd heard it on the radio a couple of times. I know when I did my show on Sparks Sunderland, I would always drop it in occasionally because it was just that perfect 4-minute opener where it's just drop that in, get it sorted, away we go. And I think it was about the time I'd started doing the albums book, just reading it through myself, which was just before the COVID lockdowns, where I was like, okay, well, I've done the Beatles now. What else have they got? And I'm sure you'll agree that there is quite a bit of quality to come from the Beatles after they'd split up, after they'd started doing their solo works. And I've always thought Band on the Run was such an incredible piece because even beyond its historical value and the story around its recording, it's such a unique piece. It's such an angry album, and it's only until you dig into the history of it. It's a very angry album because Paul McCartney was desperate for that post-Beatles acclaim that John Lennon had received, that George Harrison received, and that Ringo was... Well, actually, you know what? Ringo would probably receive that as well because he'd done his self-titled album, hadn't he?
Yeah.
It's bad when you're in a position where even Ringo's done something. So obviously he's going to be a bit disheartened, a bit discouraged. And what happens is he finds himself a guitarist and a drummer down, and it's amazing how much quality you can get when you've got two band members absent. And Paul McCartney, I imagine, is just screaming at himself in a studio, battering away on a drum kit, and that quality just shows throughout. It's obviously we don't have to take it track by track because we're not a breakdown podcast, but there are notable moments of real quality throughout Band on the Run, and the opening track sets the scene really well. I mean, the opening line, stuck inside these four walls. You can just imagine McCartney trapped inside of a studio, sort of willing himself to finish an album that, was not recorded in the best of circumstances.
What I was going to say there when you were talking about McCartney feeling that he needed to get a hit because obviously George Harrison had My Sweet Lord, which is a great hit. We've talked about Ringo, John Lennon as well. They'd all kind of had that post-Beatles success. McCartney hadn't really. I was reading the other day that he didn't necessarily feel the pressure of having to get a hit. He said that he was more waiting for it to come along, which I think shows a level of confidence that probably only McCartney would have been able to have coming out of the greatest rock band that had ever lived at that point. But then at the same time, if I'd just come out of the Beatles, 3-4 years earlier, and my three bandmates who, let's say not all of them had the same kind of musical quality as McCartney did, I think I'd feel the pressure.
Oh, yeah.
I'd be reading the reviews of my previous albums since 1970 thinking, I've got to pull something out of the bag here.
It's rather telling that sort of that immediately after the Beatles split up, he did McCartney, the self-titled album, which was not well received, and even in re-evaluations of the album, it's still not the best received. It's still not incredible. And when you compare that to something like
No.
Imagine or All Things Must Pass, which are phenomenal solo works that immediately come from the fallout of the Beatles. I mean, even I know I've said even Ringo, as if we should be shocked by that, but Ringo's self-titled album has actually got some decent stuff on it. You know, he's got Photograph and Sunshine Life for Me, which are not exactly his heavy hitters. He never really excelled past the writing stages of what he accomplished with the Beatles, but there was still that popularity for them because obviously four members of a supergroup are always going to have a popularity to them.
Mm.
How long you've got to adapt to that is very telling. So obviously McCartney's leaving it a bit late, 4 years after the Beatles have disbanded. But what he gets is, what he was waiting for essentially, which is a real hit-worthy album with a lot of quality and a lot of talent to it. And it's rather telling though, because I think this is like, other than Different Classes, probably the only album I've covered so far that's like a real favorite, like a real. I could put this on at any time, stick it on the record player, and well, if I had it on record, but I could listen to it whenever. I absolutely adore this album. I think if you had to press me and ask me like, oh, where does it rank? It's probably in the top 40 of all time for me. I think it's got
Mm.
real quality. I think it's better than a lot of Beatles albums, which is quite the confident claim. But I do think a lot of that comes from the consistency of Band on the Run. I think if you go from Band on the Run to Jet to Bluebird, there is a real quality there. And I just want to bring something up that they wrote in the insert, which is that Bluebird is a sort of companion piece to the Beatles' Blackbird. I imagine that's just because they're both called after birds, and they've thought he's recalling the Beatles there. It's like, it's not really.
Well, with that, I think I don't want to pass judgment in such a negative way, but I feel like that's just such a lazy
Yeah,
comparison to make. Um, I think Bluebird can stand alone as a track by itself, even without the comparison to Blackbird. Yes, yeah, they do both have a really gentle, probably composition. They both share sort of a really, really pared back composition and instrumentation on them. But it doesn't mean you have to compare them.
yeah.
And like I said, I think it is a lazy comparison to make just because they're both birds. Um, and I think when looking through the track list, and especially when you listen to it track by track, you've got Band on the Run, which is, I mean, typically that shouldn't be an album opener. It's a 3-track medley that usually would come at the end of an album or record, and then you get Jet, which is this all-encompassing mega hit for the band, and then you get Bluebird, which sort of pairs it back. It resets the record ever so slightly, and it acts as a bit of a palate cleanser, which I don't think Blackbird, to make the comparison that I hate to make, I don't think it did.
No, absolutely. I think a lot of, especially at the time, but obviously, I mean, this insert was written a couple of years ago, but at the time, a lot of it was waiting to see if the Beatles could actually do something better than what the Beatles were doing throughout 10 years.
Mm.
And another thing I want to take issue with is actually Let Me Roll It, which is slandered in this insert, which I think is incredibly rash because Let
Mm.
Me Roll is phenomenal. It's probably one of the best tracks on the album. But to have it slandered so
Yeah.
clearly here is just a bit of a shock to the system. Um,
This track, Let Me Roll It, was so mature for where McCartney was as a songwriter at that time. I always think of it as a later Wings track
yeah,
because it's, like I said, it's so mature. If I was put on the spot and initially I was asked what record was it on, I'd have probably said Venus and Mars because it
yeah,
sounds like something that McCartney would have done later with a bit more maturity, a bit more
a
life
bit
in the
more,
tank,
yeah.
for want of a better phrase. So to have it kind of slandered in that way, yeah, that just doesn't sit right with me. And there could be an argument to say that Let Me Roll It should be on a later album, but I think at the same time, in the same breath, it elevates everything else with it. And it's curious that McCartney, when he initially did the vocals for this, he said he didn't realise that it sounded like John Lennon, which I can't quite get my head around, because you were putting the echo on it, on your own vocals, and as soon as you hear it, surely as soon as you listen to that back for the first time, you go, "Oh, I sound like John," you know? Surely you hear
Is
that,
that
don't
a
you?
Paul McCartney impression? That was quite good.
Yeah, it was. I'd not done that
That
before.
was
That
good.
was a debut. I'm pretty happy
I
with
did one
that.
once, and somebody said, "Do you know what a Liverpudlian accent actually is?" So I've steered clear of the Beatles. It's yeah, it obviously resonates with sort of that John Lennon classic voice, that echo, and to do that subconsciously, maybe, but he should have realized at some point, oh my god, I've done it. I've actually gone and copied him. The fact that he doesn't is either a bold display of how quick he was working, or the fact that he just didn't want to
Hmm.
realize it. Um, it yeah, it's the pastiche, isn't it? It's the whole, and
Hmm.
obviously it doesn't help that at the time there was a real back and forth, or rather there was back and forth that was reported by the press between the two. Obviously they were trying to one up each other allegedly, and it does feed into that a lot when really, like you said, it does sound like something from Venus and Mars. I took the time to listen to all these bloody Wings albums, and what I've found is a consistency that I didn't think they'd have. Um,
Hmm.
I can't think of anything apart from Wings at the Speed of Sound that is particularly terrible. I think Wings at the Speed of Sound just
Yeah.
suffers from its sort of gluttonous approach. I don't think She's My Baby's that too like good. Cook at the House, pretty dreadful. It's a mixed bag. But then if you go back, 3 years to Band on the Run, which is essentially the peak of the band, you have such quality, and I think for me, Jet and Band on the Run, obviously the two big singles are phenomenal. They're obvious choices for sort of timeless McCartney songs, um, which I suppose we should address. This is just a Paul McCartney album. Wings have come along for the ride.
Yeah.
That just needs to be said. It's and it's rather telling that the best Wings album is the one where Paul McCartney takes control of most of the instrumentals, and you see that on his solo work that followed Wings, and even very recently with something like McCartney 3, where it's him doing all of the work. He's playing all the instruments, he's doing the vocals, he's mixing it, he's recording it. It's a very McCartney-led project, and there are other people in the background sort of going, do you want some help? It's like, you just go and play the drums. And it's like, right, okay, thanks, Paul, we'll do that now. This is such a McCartney-centric project, and you can tell. I mean, if you look at something like 1985, which is just, it has remnants of the Beatles where they would replicate the final moments of a song in a different song. You've got Band on the Run playing out at the end as if it's going to loop back round to the first track. It's really interesting that this would, I think apart from the John Lennon bit where he accidentally replicated the sound of his writing partner for about 10 years, and the fact that he's trying to loop it round to the start of the album, it's not Beatles-esque, but it has remnants of what the Beatles were doing in their prime. It has those aspects that were sort of very, very, very associated with the Beatles. The long form track on the B side of Abbey Road, the ability to segment a recording and put it at the end of a track to essentially say, oh, there's this on the other side, flip it back over. It's good. It's still got that like pop fun to it, and I guess that's what McCartney started to lean in a bit more than his other bandmates. Where obviously John Lennon started getting very political with his music. Ringo Starr just started. I don't know what Ringo started doing. He started posing with roses on the front of album covers, and George Harrison obviously took it down the route of whatever he was doing on Cloud Nine. Eric Idle influences that one. But Paul McCartney was really just, you can tell he's just trying to have fun. And I think the best example of that is a few years later when he did Coming Up, which I absolutely love
Hmm.
that song. I think it's adorable. Um, that fun is found on Band on the Run, but there is a bit more of a cutting edge underneath it where it's McCartney has something to prove, he has something to deal with, and he does so very successfully.
When you say he's got something to deal with, like
Yeah.
absolutely. You said earlier on that literally the day before they were boarding this flight to Lagos, Nigeria, which is a story in
Yeah.
itself, because
It's
he had the world at his fingertips. He had EMI Studios all over the world to choose where you wanted to record this. And you thought, yeah, I'm going to go to Nigeria. Of all the places, it's so, I was going to say unnecessary, but when you look at it through the lens of this is Paul McCartney, how
Of
rock and
course,
roll
it's
is that? Just
classic
go,
McCartney.
I'm going to go to Nigeria to record this album, and it's going to be the best bloody album I've made in years. And he had, so yeah, that happened. He had two members leave literally the day before they got on this flight. He must have been so angry. If I was in a band and two of my band members just jumped ship less than 24 hours before we were going to record an album, I'd be absolutely seething. And I think he must have had this burning desire inside him to go, I'm going to create an album that you wish you were on. And it's a massive two fingers up to them both to say, what a trick you've missed here. What a trick you've missed here. I remember about, it's probably about a decade ago now, Kaiser Chiefs original drummer, Nick Hodgson, who'd been one of the founding members of the band, left. Just sort of, he was tired of the touring. He wasn't getting the joy out of writing music with the band anymore, and he wanted to do sort of his own solo stuff. He wanted to have a record label, and he jumped ship. And that left Kaiser Chiefs without their main writer, and they needed to find who they were again. And Ricky Wilson, the front man of the band, always said he was so angry after he left. He played it well and coolly on the surface to say, look, he's made his choice, he wants to leave, but he was so angry. Kaiser's next record, Education, Education, Education and War, was just pure anger. And it's one of the best records because it had so much emotion built up inside of them, and they just let it out. So this reminds me ever so slightly, Band on the Run is obviously a much better album, but it reminds me of that in a way that there was so much emotion built up inside of the people who were putting this album together that it obviously turned into creative spirit and creative freedom, that they did something that they probably would not have been able to do without this inconvenience that happened beforehand.
I couldn't have put it better there. There is so many albums that you can think of where it's behind it is a sincere anger towards someone or something, to the point where they've thought, I'm going to make one of the best albums of all time just out of spite. And it shows on Band on the Run. I can't imagine the mindset of someone who has landed in Lagos, realised that there is a military civil war going on, and then is bungled into a recording studio with two band members down, promptly after being mugged.
A recording studio which
Yeah,
was
it wasn't
barely built,
finished, was
let's
it?
say as
It
well.
was
No.
to pull anything out of those recording sessions is a miracle. Considering how long it took to get something out of the Let It Be recording sessions, it's a monumental achievement. To do so without a fully functioning studio, without your wallet, and without two members of your band is quite the feat. And I'm glad you brought up Kaiser Chiefs, because I actually did a deep dive of their discography recently. And it's that switch. You just listen to the first couple of albums, like, this is very nice, nice pop, Britpop influence, very nice, very good. Then you get Education, 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 War, and it's like, oh, something's happened here, lads. What's the matter? It's great, and it's nice when it's obvious, because Band on the Run is very, very subtle in where its anger is directed, but very obvious it is a very angry album. You think of Red Rose Speedway and sort of how placid it is, really, how pop it is, and McCartney's never relinquished that pop attitude, and I think that's one of his best assets, but sometimes he just needs to know how to form it and where to push it, something like Chaos and Creation in the Backyard of Flaming Pie, where he's reflective and he uses the pop mentality to actually reflect on his career and his life and his wife. That's really good. On the other hand, you've got stuff like Wonderful Christmastime, which I think is genuinely the best Christmas song ever made, where Paul McCartney's locked himself in the studio with 5 bottles of mulled wine. He's using that pop influence to just essentially poke fun at Christmas tracks of the time. It's nonsensical. The lyrics don't make any sense, but people love it because of the the very thick beat underneath it, and it's delightful. What you get on Band on the Run is a pop album with real anger to it, and I don't want to make that, oh, well, today's music's not very good. There are not many pop albums that are truly as venomously angry as Band on the Run. I can't think of many albums in general that are as angry as Band on the Run. I think a lot of it does come down to where McCartney finds himself. I do think a lot of it comes down to where the rest of the Beatles found themselves, because if you're
Mm.
lodged firmly in fourth place out of the rest of your bandmates, that's not a good look. That's not a good look, regardless of how well he was achieving and how well he was handling it. It's just not a good look. And to take something like Band on the Run and essentially elevate himself with it is incredible, because Band on the Run is pretty scattershot when it comes down to what's actually listed. I mean, he goes from Let Me Roll It to Mammonia, which is such a, obviously you got to flip the album, but that's such a change of pace, and I don't think it would work for
Mm.
anybody else. I think McCartney's really hit the nail on the head for sort of energetic, angry pop music.
I was saying before that I don't think Band on the Run, the track Band on the Run works as an opener. When you said going from Let Me Roll It to Mammonia, yeah, you got to flip the record, but again, that shouldn't work as an opening of a
No,
side.
not
But
at all.
again, I said it shouldn't work because it kind of does, and I think it has that reset the same way that Bluebird does, probably because you've
Yeah,
had probably the angriest sounding track on the record, Let Me Roll It, beforehand, and it needed that just sort of 2 or 3 minutes of reset with Mammonia, and it does that. It's like it's a proper palate cleanser, because you were
it
talking
is
earlier about
absolutely.
um how much McCartney sounds like Lennon in the vocals, but we totally like avoided for some reason talking about the riff on Let Me Roll It, because it is very angry, but it's
Yeah,
the riff is, it's not an aggressively fast-paced one. It's the pace is slow, and it's deliberately slow, and then it stops, and then it comes in again. I don't know about you. It makes
yeah,
me. I can't play guitar. I can't play any instrument really. I can just about manage to hold a beat on a drum kit, but it makes me want to be able to play the guitar. It makes me want to think, I can be Paul McCartney here. I don't know about. I don't know. I know
yeah.
you can
Oh,
sort of play a
absolutely.
bit, but I don't know. Does it give you a bit of inspiration?
It does, yeah. I mean, it's like I haven't. So I've got a guitar behind me. I don't think people watching can see it because I split the video, but there is a guitar to my corner. I would grab it, but then there's a bit of awkward radio silence, isn't there? And I don't want to sit with a guitar and strum it like that. You know, I might get the guitar. I will actually get out of the chair for this podcast episode. If you want to entertain people for about
I
10
can.
seconds, why don't you talk about Blackbird and Bluebird or
I
something?
can. Yeah, I could talk about Blackbird and Bluebird, but for those just listening, I can see Ewan grabbing his guitar now, and it looks like a really nice guitar. For those of you who aren't able to watch this, and he really looks like a guitar player. He looks like a musician while he's holding this.
So I do have a guitar. It's very dusty because I've not touched it in about a year. Um, but I did learn how to play a bit of it. It's very out of tune, so I'm not going to like
This is
very
exciting.
out of
This is really
tune.
exciting.
It's very out of tune. The only song, and I remember the only reason I could play it is because I absolutely love this song. I could only play the opening to Something Changed by Pulp.
Of course.
And the reason I could play the opening was because all it was a G chord strummed in a very particular way. So, you know, if you get a G chord, which I can't remember, that's
That's
not
not a
G.
G.
That's not a G. No, it's been about a year since I've actually touched the guitar. But every now and then when I'm listening or I'm reviewing a track, new or old, but particularly Let Me Roll It, you do get the impression it's like I should pick up the guitar and I should really do something with it, because I could do it. I'm just very lazy. But hearing that riff on Let Me Roll It, it's something like, you know, there's an anger to it, like you mentioned, like you spoke of very well there. And it's the thing about McCartney is that you do not get the impression that he's an angry
No.
musician. You do not get the impression that McCartney is a particularly angry man. And the reason I say that is because of that one Simpsons episode where he's sat on the Quickie Mart roof with Linda McCartney talking to Lisa about vegetarianism. And you don't ever feel that he's particularly has what it takes to be
Mm.
angry. And there are segments on Band on the Run that are just so terrifyingly matured and angry. Let Me Roll It's guitar piece, for instance, is the perfect example where it kind of crashes through. It feels like McCartney has, you know, when you get like when you scrumble a piece of paper up and it's like throw it
Mm.
away. It feels like he's doing that to his guitar chord, so it's kind of just like I'm not going to do it because it'll sound awful on the audio, but it sounds like he's just kind of attacking this bit of the guitar. It feels like he's got a note in mind, whereas that nearly fell off my chair. He's got a note in mind up here. Like that's not the issue. The issue is how he wants to play it. Now McCartney's, usually quite a reserved musician. He's not exactly gonna explode. He's never angry. Even if you think about something like Coming Up, the boldest he goes is that or that really high pitched little whine he does, which is lovely. You never expect him to sort of relinquish control of how he feels and just kind of go for it. And it's really quite amazing to think that the only reason he does that is because his guitarist did not come with him. He was left to his own devices and sort of left to piece things together. And it really does feel very emotionally charged because of just how freestyle it feels. How you can't write a note like that, you can't write a lyric like that, you can't write that emotion. I've been reading the Nick Cave book recently. I'm just going to prop that there and hope it doesn't fall on my new Doc Martens because, of course, I look like a band member. It's Nick Cave wrote that some of the lyrics he writes on something like Ghosteen or Skeleton Tree couldn't actually be written down because they just wouldn't make sense to write them. If you read them, they wouldn't make sense. They wouldn't have the same power as it does because a lot of his lyrics now are very simplistic, but they're very depthful. They're very spur of the moment. They come to him as he's recording or as he's piecing together a piece of music with Warren Ellis. What you get is a real emotional core, and a lot of the time, an emotional moment in a song or a launch pad for it can be a very simple chord structure or a very simple lyric. And I think the one on Ghosteen, for instance, I can't remember what song. It might be a Spinning song where it's just Nick Cave repeating "and I love you," and that's it. On paper, that looks terrible. On paper, that doesn't mean anything. That's really simple songwriting. When it's paired with the right music and when it's done with the right vocal range, it you get the emotion that he's trying to convey, which is where he agreed that some lyrics just can't be written, some just have to come in the spur of the moment. Let Me Roll With It is a very reactionary song. I don't think it's reactionary to Lennon particularly. I get the comparison, and obviously you can't avoid the back and forth that they had. What I do think it's a reaction to is just how angry he was at the time, because I'd be quite angry at that instance. I'd be furious. Like I would actually, I'd be angry to the point where I wouldn't be able to do anything. I think anger sort of paralyzes me sometimes, where it's like I get really angry with myself when I don't do enough work, which is ridiculous. But I remember last night I was like sat 2 a.m. playing Football Manager, pushing through to the Champions League playoffs, and up the Tigers, Hull City. And I was just sort of clicked, and it was like I should be doing work right now, and it's 2 a.m. I'm like, why am I not doing work? And I get that feeling with McCartney here, where it's like it's just sat in the studio, barely finished, and it's like, why have I not finished this? Why have I not fucking released the single yet? Where am I? And it's so nice. And I think what happens is you get such a large variety of theme and song, and just sort of instrumental changes. Like you've got Let Me Roll With It, which is a very harsh, thrashy guitar sound, and then you've got 1985, which is 1985. Sorry, not 1985. Which is just a really nice soundscape type of thing. It's very broad, it's very experimental, and I suppose this is the real turning point for McCartney as a serious solo musician. This is the big leap.
This is a claim I didn't think I was necessarily going to make, but I might just make it anyway. And then this is stuck in the depths of time forever. But 1985, I think it's one of McCartney's best compositions. I think.
No, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
I know it's a big claim because there's a lot that we could dive into there, but it's so charming. I know we've talked about this anger that he would have had, the desire to get a hit, which he did with Band of the Run and Single and Jet, which we definitely need to talk about. But I think it sits perfectly on this record because it's right at the end. It's the last track. He's got the anger out of his system, and then it's like it's like when there's a thunderstorm. I don't know where I'm going with this. It's like when there's a thunderstorm and it's grey, it's probably raining, there's thunder, there's lightning, it's all very aggressive and gritty and powerful, and then 10 minutes later the sun comes out, and the sun coming out is 1985. I'm glad that analogy worked.
It does. It does.
And
He's calmed down.
yeah,
He's
and
weathered the storm.
he has, exactly, and it sounds like it's a transition. As much as at the very end of the track, there's an excerpt of Band on the Run itself, which I think you said this before. That it makes you probably want to put the record back on. It reminds me a bit of Sergeant Pepper at the end of A Day in the Life, where the
Yes.
record's
Yeah.
cut into itself and it just plays and plays and plays, and it's as if the Beatles are saying, "You are going to listen to this forever and ever and ever." I think the way that they've done this on Band on the Run is it's a bit more intelligent, because rather than just cutting into itself and just the outro just plays and plays and plays, they remind you at the end of 1985 that Band on the Run itself is a great song, and you think, I'm gonna go and put it back on, and then you'll flip the record back over and you'll just listen to the record again because you've been encouraged to do so. So as much as you've got that at the end of it, I think it's a nice transition into where Paul McCartney would then end up. He's got the anger out of his system, and then he can be a bit more playful with his music. I don't know if you agree with that.
I do agree with that, because essentially you've got very tense, angry songs, and then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm a pop musician." And he's like, "Right, let's just sort something out, sort a nice composition." I do agree. I think what really stuck with me the most recent time I listened to Band of the Run, which was yesterday, um, the composition of that track is so unlike anything else on the record. But
Mm-hmm.
you can say that about all the tracks. This is a record that shouldn't work. This is a record that has a lot of the songs here as individual pieces.
Yeah.
And I suppose that it's rather telling that McCartney had success previously, but with singles. Live and Let Die was the big one, the Bond soundtrack. Um, he decides here almost to just put those together onto an album. Here's a lot of segments, fractures, just bits and pieces that shouldn't work together, but because I don't know who mixed this, I don't know who produced it, but it's so impressive that this works as an album. And I think, like you said, on 1985, it's I think McCartney said in an interview, it's certain songs that he writes, something like Eleanor Rigby. The first line is the whole song.
Mm.
So it's obviously with Eleanor Rigby, it was picked up the right in the church where the wedding has been. That was his angle, that was his first line, and then from there it's flowed. For 1985, it was No One Ever Left Alive in 1985, which is a really nice one-line rhyme. I really like. I'm a sucker for stuff like that. If you can hide a rhyme in a song, I'm going to be very angry, but I'll be very impressed. You know, but the fact that it's sort of just there, and then it's got organs and mellotron, and it just sort of, it's such a huge cacophony. It feels like a rush and a surge of relief for McCartney, who essentially ends this record on, you know for a fact that this is good. Please turn over once more. And that's such a powerful end for the album. I think it's incredible.
And
It's
you
rather
mentioned with the
surprising.
I was going to say, you mentioned with kind of the organ, the mellotron, that sort of thing, but even if you listen to it and drill down, even just to the attention to detail, I think there's
Yeah.
maracas in there, but like, which usually you just wouldn't think, if you listen to it, you wouldn't notice, some maracas on a track. But I listened to it yesterday morning, and I'd never noticed them before, but it was just like, they're there, and it shouldn't add
Oh
to the
yeah.
track, but it does. And
That's the thing. I think there's so many examples. I think my favorite one is Common People, because the whole point of this podcast is that that's a song from the best album ever made. There are so many stock recordings in that track that are used for the briefest of seconds, but it stops a delay for about half a second or a millisecond of empty dead air. So there's like a laser beam sound effect that they've just dropped in because it'll buy up a bit of time. There's an acoustic guitar under it that you'll never hear, but it's there. And you get that feeling with a lot of the tracks on Band on the Run, where it's McCartney is throwing everything he's got at it. Partly because he knows it's going to work, but partly, I think, out of just sort of sheer anger. He's like, yeah, let's get the maracas in. Get the maracas in, Linda. And it's like, right, all right, Paul. Jesus. And I think that comes about with Band on the Run, which, like you said very early on, it's a 3-part medley. And I remember a comedian on Twitter, Rob Delaney, saying Paul McCartney should be thrown back into the studio and made to write the other 2 songs that are part of Band on the Run, because
Yeah.
that is one song that could be 3 very different ones. You go
Mhm.
from the I don't have the words to describe how much I like the opening riff to Band on the Run, but I absolutely love it.
Mm.
I can hear that and think, yeah, absolutely. And then it bursts out into this sort of chorus of Band on the Run, and then the story that evolves around it. It's just such a, again, I'm always going to go back to it. It's something that shouldn't work, but McCartney is so adamant that it will, that it just works. It just does. And I don't have the musical terms to describe why that works. It
Yeah.
just does. It's the same for Jet. Jet shouldn't work. Jet is so much fun, though. Um, I'm still not sure what Jet's about, to be honest. I just know I like it.
Well, this is the thing. When I was reading about this this week, 'cause I know I was recording this with you, and some people say it's about a pony that he had in Scotland. Some people said it was about um, a dog, a golden Labrador,
Oh, his
and then
puppy, yeah.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
just early this morning, I remembered that I've got last year Paul McCartney released a book, like a proper
He did,
a
yeah.
double book of like a deep dive into the lyrics and the composition of all of his singles he's ever released. And I was like, I wonder what he says himself about Jet. So I had a look, and he said it was about a pony, but he he said, I can't remember the exact quote that was written in the book, but he said it's so unimportant. It's as unimportant as knowing that Martha My Dear is about a dog. It doesn't matter. We can pick this apart as much as we want. Paul himself, he doesn't care. You know,
Yeah.
and you said before about this track, it's so much fun, and I suppose it's great that we've talked about the anger that he would have had composing this, but it's so refreshing and great for us as listeners to be able to enjoy a fun track that came out of the anger. There's everything that's in it. I know quite a big part of the composition is Linda just sort of smashing the keys on a piano, which she's she's not a fully formed musician. She's it's what Meg White would make a career out of. Just not being able to be a fully formed musician, but she kind of that's sort of the charming aspect of it. That yes, this is practically just a McCartney album, just Paul himself, but
Yeah.
there's something that you can treasure knowing that she was there and just sort of, I'll give this a go. I'll put something fun into it. And it's nice that the three of them two, and Denny Lane as well, who I still think just sounds like a character. Um, you know,
Yeah. It's,
they,
yeah.
they, it, it's lovely to hear that they were able to have fun in the studio at the same time.
Yeah, it's, there are not many studio stories where a band will say, oh, we went to the studio, we had a lot of fun, and then we got a hit album out of it. There are not many stories like that, especially
Yeah.
not in studios that are barely being built. And I suppose Band on the Run is the crux of what was going wrong for McCartney at the time with his music.
Mm.
He was being too individual, he was being too experimental, and critics just simply did not like that. You think of McCartney, you think of the early Wings album, stuff like Wildlife and Red Rose Speedway. Red Rose Speedway felt a bit just indifferent. It's a very pop oriented album, but Wildlife had sort of remnants of what could be expanded on. It's it's a solid debut. I think something like Bit Bop does my fucking nut in. It's like Obla Di Obla Da, but for Wings. But stuff like Tomorrow and Dear Friend are really nicely worked, really expression fueled tracks, and you get that feeling on Band on the Run. You get that layering, you get that composition, and he gets it right. I think a lot of recording is a frame of mind, and McCartney is now in the frame of mind to do that. I think it does re-establish some of the confidence he might have lost,
Mm.
because you think about what he was doing after Band on the Run, not just with Wings but his solo career as well. It was just strength from strength, strength to strength, not strength from strength. um Venus and Mars followed. Obviously he did the collection of Wings albums. I still think Back to the Egg's really good, and London Town's really solid as well.
Yeah.
But then after that you've got McCartney 2, and then he did Two of War, Pipes of Peace, Press to Play. He starts running through this sort of creative burst. He also did a film in that time with Ringo Starr called "Give My Regards to Broad Street," which is horrendous. Um, but then even 20, 30 years on from Band on the Run, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard and Egypt Station are just
Mm.
really powerful albums, and they get to grips with what exactly makes McCartney tick, and a lot of it is just pure rage and reflection, which is nice to see, because I think it does help the legacy of the album, which is essentially the best thing Wings ever did, and probably one of the best things McCartney ever did. Whether or not it's better than his Beatles work is always up for debate. It's difficult to assess it, and I don't want to push you into decisions, because to wonder whether McCartney on his own is better than some of his Beatles work is rather difficult. I think
Mm.
I think some of his best tracks are in his solo work. I think
Yeah.
some of his best albums are with the Beatles, and I think Band on the Run is a lot better than a lot of Beatles albums. I would rank it higher than Revolver. I would rank it higher than Rubber Soul. I would rank it higher than maybe Sergeant Pepper's. I don't know. That's exactly. Stern looks there. It's not exactly as good as Abbey Road,
No.
but it's not. It's better than Help. It's better than with the Beatles. It's better than a lot of Beatles albums.
Mm.
Um, I think Sergeant Pepper's is where we have to draw the line, I suppose, on Band on the Run.
I think so.
Um,
You think it is so easy to sort of make comparisons to where McCartney is, at this time in 1973 to where he was with the Beatles, and even this year, when he was headlining Glastonbury, there were so many comments flying around, not just on Twitter, but in reviews, in tabloid reviews, in reviews in kind of more established kind of music publications that compared him, at 80 years old to where he was 50, nearly 60 years ago. And I think you've got to take a step back and go, this man is a musician at different times in his life. He was a musician in the 60s, and then he changed tack to go, slightly solo, then into a different band in the 70s, and then in the 80s, the 90s. He's a different musician at every different point. So I'd love to say, it, Band on the Run is better than, well, it's definitely better than With the Beatles, that's for sure. But when you get into the kind of the more critically acclaimed and more established records that the Beatles released, that's when the waters become a bit more murky, because you have to judge these pieces as individual pieces rather than just compare them. I know we love music, we both review music, so part of our job is to kind of compare and contrast. But then that works to an extent, but then sometimes you've got to judge it as it is at a specific time under specific circumstances. We've said already that this is sort of like a McCartney album, sort of like what could have been McCartney 2. And in the same way that Flamin' Pie, which was ultimately, 99% of the work was done by McCartney himself, other than this, I can't remember what track it was, but the one that he did with Steve Miller on that album.
Yeah,
I can't remember. He recorded at his ranch. Never mind. I can't remember. I'll leave you to have a little look while I rant about this. But, when McCartney does something so individual, which is what Band on the Run was, again, like I said, you've got to judge it on its own merit. I know I've mentioned Flamin' Pie there, but it would be easy for me to go, okay, let's sit Band on the Run and Flamin' Pie side by side, and okay, let's do a track by track. Is Young Boy better than Jet? Yeah, I could have that discussion with my head and go back and forward, but individually, they're both great tracks, and they both deserve to be a single on those individual albums.
Definitely. I think a lot of it comes with the place McCartney finds himself at the time. Obviously, we spoke about the place that McCartney found himself, the anger he found with Band on the Run. But then you take something like Run Devil Run, which is a collection of 50s and 60s hit covers, essentially. the mindset he was in at the time was, I think it was around the time Linda McCartney died, and he just thought, well, I'm going to channel that. I'm going to do something musical. And what you get is like a really solid collection of covers. For something like Flaming Pie, which Steve Miller was on, Used to Be Bad. He was on that. And also McCartney appears to have given a small musician a bit of credit on Really Love You. A guy called Richard Starkey appeared on drums.
Oh,
It's nice
wonder
to
what happened to
elevate
him.
small musicians. Nothing happened to him. After 1969, he retired. That's it. That's all I feel of it. He did not make an album called What's My Name. He just didn't do it. It's awful.
And that must not have been the guy who narrated Thomas and Friends either. Couldn't have been him, could it?
It's rather, if we look at the legacy of the main four Beatles, I don't want to drift off away from talking about McCartney too much, but the legacy of the Beatles is, rewarding. The legacy of Ringo Starr is he was a narrator on a children's program. That's his legacy. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to have much of a better legacy than Ringo Starr, because I will never voice Thomas the Tank Engine.
Sadly.
I'd be a great narrator for Thomas the Tank. Thomas and his pals are up to something. I don't know, just watch. There, done. But no, as far as sort of, like you said, the individuality of each track on this album, it's so stunning. It's why I really love the album. I can't pick out a bad track on this one.
No.
Like Picasso's Last Words, which we didn't quite touch on, but it's just so well worked. I think that's the most consistent thing. All of these tracks are well worked. All of them deserve a spot on the album. It's hard to see where anything could be changed or cut or removed. And I suppose that's the legacy of it, though. It's sort of Band on the Run was the turning point. It's not, like the insert said, the massive critical explosion that it was meant to be. It wasn't the explosion of commercial value for McCartney. Because, Band on the Run, while it did sell well, people were still a bit unsure of the whole Wings label. They looked at Band on the Run and thought, oh, don't know about this, lads. Wings. Red Rose Speedway wasn't too good. So it did take a bit of time for it to actually garner traction and sort of reclaim its spot. But I do think Band on the Run, it's a very different album to what the other Beatles were doing at the time. But the question has to be asked, is this the best solo album from a Beatles member? Just a small question. It's a difficult one, isn't it?
I don't want... Right, so I don't want to sort of have my judgment, I don't want recency bias to come into this too much, but when McCartney released Egypt Station, 4 years ago, that was kind of the time that I was probably most invested in what he was doing musically. Obviously 2013's New was all right. I think solid. Where I was musically, it was more poppy, it was more commercial. You probably would hate to hear it be described as commercial, but it was. So when Egypt Station came out, I heard it, I fell in love with it instantly, and I'll still listen to it now. It's probably his only concept album, really. So again, it comes back to kind of comparing where he was at different generations, and probably where all four of them were really at different generations. If push came to shove, I'd probably say, Band on the Run sits slightly below Egypt Station, but again, recency bias, trying to get it out of my head. I don't know, maybe it's to sit level pegging. I don't know. You've asked me a very difficult question. I'm struggling to commit to an answer here.
That's why I like hosting podcasts, because I don't have to answer any of these questions, which is ideal. I can just think, I don't really know the answer to this, just project it onto someone else. That's the benefit of being
who also doesn't know the answer to it.
I have no idea. I think, because I was going to say just adamantly, Band on the Run's the best album. For me personally, it is, but I don't think long term or culturally impact wise, I don't know if it is the best album, because you've got to think All Things Must Pass and the absolute revolution that was, or something like even Imagine or Plastic Ono Band, which are both albums that I wouldn't particularly listen to over Band on the Run, but have so much extra to explore. I think it's such a varied time for the Beatles, and of course we can't leave out Ringo. He had one moment I'll get one of his albums that isn't What's My Name, or his self-titled album. What was he doing? Why hasn't he done anything? He was on one track with George Harrison called When We Was Fab, and
When We Was Fab,
yeah, it's not a bad song, to be fair. There we go. He did.
Which was, I mean, when you mentioned We Was Fab,
Yeah,
that was a great record. That
it was. Yeah.
that one there. Yeah.
George Harrison's got it in to just make fun pop, and then he did Traveling Wilburys.
Yeah.
Ringo Starr did Ringo 2012. There we go.
Is that the one with the red and white cover?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine he released that the same year as the Olympics to try and cash in on the 2012 Olympics, but I can't prove that.
Didn't actually get a look in.
Did not
really,
get
did
a
he?
look in, no. Someone has reviewed this and just written the word bland, so...
Sounds about right.
Yeah, I mean, that's Ringo, though, isn't it? But speaking of bland, Band on the Run, is it an album that needs to be on the 1001 albums of all time list? Is it one of those albums that people need to listen to? Because that is essentially the aim of that list. The 1001 albums you must listen to. Mandatory. You're going to be put in a room and listen to all of them. Is Band on the Run one of them?
Yes. I don't know how much detail you want on the back of yes. No, but I think the past hour has kind of given you the detail, and that soundbite there, yes.
Perfect. And just one last question, because I've skipped it because I didn't see it in my notes. What's the best track on Band on the Run?
1985.
Ooh, okay. So we've gone for opposite ends of the album, because I've been really basic and put Band on the Run. Because it's the title track. That'll do. No, I suppose that wraps it up. Do you want to plug away your socials and where people can read your work? I always think that the best part of podcasting is that we get to project our terrible thoughts onto people, and then at the very end say you can get more of that at these places.
Thanks. Yeah. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me at the Callum Rowe. At Callum Rowe was already taken, frustratingly. But yeah, at the Callum Rowe. If you are anyway inclined to follow the Eurovision Song Contest, you can find my reviews and opinions and features at aboutthecontest.com. And I also write news for the Eurotrip podcast as well, eurotrippodcast.com. And I also do fleeting bits of work for Spark Sunderland as well when I have the time.
Lovely. A nice collection there. It'll all roll across the bottom of the screen because I've worked it out in iMovie. I worked it out a couple of weeks ago. For people listening, it'll sound like I worked it out months ago and still bragging about it. But I can work iMovie now. So to
those listening, it will look like the BBC News ticker with the headlines along the bottom. Is that right?
For people that watch it on YouTube, they'll get to see sort of the expansive excellence of iMovie's editing software. For those listening, hard cheese. But you can find me on Twitter and a load of other places at Ewan Gleadow, EWANGLEADOW. You can follow Don't Listen to This Podcast on Twitter at DLTTPod. And if you follow me, I promise I'll never play this guitar on another episode of the podcast. That's
worth a follow. That's worth a follow.
I'd say it's worth making fake accounts to follow me on. For every follower I get, you delay me playing the opening to Something Changed by one episode. We've got over 1,000 to go, so there is a limit to how much you can delay this by. But I will play it.
Also, I hope as well, every follower you gain, you forget how to play one chord on a guitar.
That's going to be really worrying because I know about 4. I mean, it's more than Ian Brown ever learnt, so I should be all right. I suppose on that Ian Brown slander, we'll end it there. So